since early on in StarCraft 2, actually way back even in sort of like end of 2010 going into 2011, we began to see some Korean players go over to Western teams. Now, usually this was quite different to what we're seeing and what I'm going to address now, which is in the past it tended to be sort of a lower level, like low A team, high B team sort of player where it was a gamble for the Western team, but they thought this guy has some potential and we'll take him to some foreign tournaments so the competition's a bit easier and see how he does. And so it made sense as to how these Western teams could get these players. But the different trend that I've noticed now and over the last sort of year and a half has been of big names going over. Names that within the Korean scene really have been like the best players ever or really huge, like marquee level names, which if the Korean scene's in a healthy place and it's established and there's somewhere it's going to go, they should be retaining these names. Some of these names should still be around. And so some obvious ones I think of is like, you think of Dong Regu going to Invasion, Fantasy went to Dead Pixels, Rain went to My Insanity, Hydra went to Root. There was a point in time where Deer went to Mouse Sports, but the reason why I picked those names out is because those are players who, in terms of their history, at least in StarCraft in general, okay, in case of like Fantasy and Hydra, not really so much in StarCraft 2, but in StarCraft in general, these are big names in Korea, in the Korean esports scene, and the teams they're going to aren't big names in the West. Those aren't premier level tier 1 organizations in the West. This isn't like Jaedong going to EG. And so this situation of big name players going to these small teams in Europe, and some of them who you might have never heard of before these teams happened in this particular sense, if you just follow like the big tournaments only, what's worrying about that is kind of like threefold, I think. So first and foremost, it's a little bit disturbing in terms of what it might say about the health of the Korean StarCraft 2 scene. Secondly, it potentially opens these players up to some kinds of hardships and maybe even sorts of abuse that they won't expect, and I'm not sure they know how to deal with. Thirdly, it seems to often be overlooked or maybe a bit naively misunderstood. And so a lot of Western fans might take it as like, oh, this is a good thing. And they're going to come to Western tournaments and like, oh, this is great. They're playing for a Western team. Like maybe I've even heard of the Western team. Like, oh, I thought it was a small team, but oh, cool. They've got this big player. It's almost billed as like, this is a good thing. And this is even some sort of progression for esports and the West is getting good players. And I'm a bit skeptical about that. So first of all, like the first thing I brought up, like what does it say about the Korean scene? The first really big name example of this, okay, so like I mentioned before, I kind of referenced, so people like Hero and Tasia going to the West, those were more just gambles on the parts of the teams, looking at some player who seems like, yeah, he looks like he'd be good, and maybe he's having some issues now in GSL, but if you put him into like an IEM, maybe he'd do well there. That's all fine, that makes sense. And they're going to Team Liquid, who were like a top organization in the West, at least tier 2 at the very least, probably tier 1 overall. But in this particular scenario, okay, when Jaedong went to Evil Geniuses, that actually was one of the first moments that made me a bit skeptical about StarCraft 2 and what Kesper's StarCraft 2 world was going to be like, because within the history of Korean esports, in terms of how Brood War worked, there is no way in a million years someone like Jaedong could have gone to a foreign organization. Now, admittedly, yeah, obviously the foreign organizations, Brood War wasn't big in the West, so they didn't have big teams and it wasn't a big priority. But even in a world where foreign teams had the same stature they had in StarCraft 2, there's no way a Jaedong would have been allowed to leave Kesper and go to a big org like Evil Geniuses. And the reason why I say that is because in Brood War, the game itself was still big enough and still on television, like on GameNet and NBC Game, that as a result, some of these big name players, so obviously famous ones like Boxer, Nada, these players didn't even have to be good towards the ends of their career. Like Nada, by the end of like the sort of 2010, 2011 sort of era, actually 2010 wouldn't make sense because StarCraft 2, so 2009 going into 2010, by this period he wasn't a great player. Like the best case scenario, maybe he'd make a run to around 16 once, but overall he was just like an average pro at this point. In fact, I think his rating was way down. I think he was maybe like 60th or that sort, maybe 40th to 60th ranked in the Kesper rankings, so his level was way below the level of like Nada, the guy winning MSLs and OSLs and all these sorts of things, and the great player. But crucially, within the esports scene and within Korea itself, he was still perceived to have great market value because he was like a legacy player, a legendary name, and as a result, We Made Fox, these teams he was playing for, were still paying him an incredibly high salary just to sort of be on the team and be a figurehead name and just play. because the marketing value, the perceived value you could have from him was so huge. So even if his level had dropped off even more, you wouldn't get rid of him. You'd still want him to be around the team and hopefully be able to play on the A team still. And like they kind of did with Boxer and SKT, every now and then you'll send him out for I'm talking about if he'd got much worse. Not his level was still okay. But in terms of Boxer's case, he wasn't like at a pro level anymore. So what they would do is they'd almost use him as kind of like the SKT1 mascot. They'd send him out for the odd game to play a game and people would cheer and hope that he won. And he probably wouldn't versus really good players. And really in general, he was just practicing, but he was just going to be a BT player, even though he was this big name. But obviously, Im Yo-Wan is the guy you want on your team. You still want to be able to market that and be like, yeah, we still got this great player and having him do interviews and do press. That all makes sense. So the fact that Jaedong would leave Kesper in general, wouldn't just go to another Kesper team, like they wouldn't outbid them and get him, etc., was initially something I was a bit skeptical about. I was like, wow, maybe that's not going to be the case in StarCraft 2, because StarCraft 2 as a game obviously doesn't have the place that Brood War had culturally, and it's never been as popular, and it's more in the West it's popular rather than in Korea overall. So okay, that kind of told me like maybe we're not going to be in the same sort of world we were before. But even more so, I actually think that one I wasn't so skeptical about when I kind of heard some things behind the scenes. Like I heard murmurings behind the scenes without betraying any confidences that perhaps Jaedong going to EG was also in some way linked to Evil Geniuses getting that Pro League spot, and that was something to do with the idea that Evil Geniuses was going to invest into sort of like the Korean infrastructure, get a house, go into Pro League. Maybe the West was going to have more of a presence in the Korean scene in that way and bring in obviously all their big sponsors and all that. So maybe Jaedong was in some way, the deal was lubricated or it was helped along, or in some way he was nudged, and that's part of why he'd then come to EG. And then also, like I said, even though Jaedong could definitely be a legacy player, could have that big name, Jaedong at the time wasn't having that level of top performance that we associate with the Jaedong name from Brood War in StarCraft 2. So it made sense also to send him to foreign tournaments, and obviously then he had all those runs to second places. So that example there, even though it was an initial point that made me start to think about this topic, I'm not that worried about that one, because there were things that added up there, even though it did still say something about the overall health of the scene. But looking at the scene now, first of all, some of these names, DRG obviously, you look at some of these names and you kind of see that like this is where the ESF team's really dying away, and that infrastructure decaying heavily in Korea has been really bad for the Korean scene, because first of all, yeah, part of the reason the ESF teams really died was due to their players just dropping off a cliff in terms of domestic performance and in terms of being great players in the West. Because Kesper teams came over with their great infrastructure, their great players, which then applied themselves to StarCraft 2, and within a year or so, we're getting very high in the GSLs, and eventually now dominate the GSLs, obviously, and the Korean scene entirely. And so they've fallen off in terms of they don't even have the results, and so the teams are kind of fractured in that sense. And some of them, crucially, some of the big names have gone over to the Korean teams, the Kesper teams rather. But those teams also died off in part because the Kesper teams, something they had that the ESF teams didn't, was the business sense as well. Some of the people who went over and made the ESF teams were just guys who were a coach in a Kesper team, but that was his only job, was to be the coach. He didn't understand the business and how this worked. And if you look at it, those ESF teams in general had a really long history of not showing any good sense for business on how to market players that they had, how to get sponsorships, how to build those sponsorships and maintain them and build them into something more, and get themselves into a position where they could even maneuver the globe, even in the same way that some of the best Western teams could, best organizations. And so probably the best example ever is Incredible Miracle. They still exist as a team now, but these guys are to me the kind of the test case of the problems that the ESF teams had, because they had everything you could want from a marketing perspective, as in they had guys on their team who'd won multiple GSL titles, then their sort of tier 2 players were winning foreign events, coming top 4, top 2, then they had one of the best teams in the team leagues, making IPTL finals and UGSTL finals, that sort of stuff. They had they had everything you could want in terms of resources as a businessman to then go out and market these players and get sponsors and build up relationships, get to a high level, and they couldn't do it. They got to kind of like an okay level, and then they kind of floundered there, and then things fell apart, and then suddenly they were, our sponsor didn't pay us, and they didn't have a backup, and as a result, we saw what happened. That their teams, where's their team now? Where are all their players now? It's a terrible situation. So you saw the ESF teams died away, and the Kesper teams kind of salvaged and scavenged some of the other players who were left. So, okay, now we're just left with only the Kesper teams really kind of representing the Korean scene. The Kesper teams, admittedly, they seem to know a bit more about the business, and they seem to have a bit more stability and sustainability behind them. And Kesper as an organization seems to have a better sense of at least some things that they're doing within the scene. But even then, there's the issue of the Kesper scene the suggestions, at least, that maybe Kesper as an organization is a bit more controlling in terms of like how many of your players can go to foreign tournaments, which tournaments can they go to, when can they get time off. Because remember, to Kesper, the main thing's always like, we want all of the best players playing Pro League as often as possible. That's the main focus, because they're still kind of in that brood war mentality. And then the other tournaments, the individual tournaments, come after that, like the GSL, and then the obviously a DreamHack and IEM, etc. So there's even the suggestion there, like, maybe the health of the Korean scene is in some way, as much as it's good to have Kesper, limited to a degree, because maybe Kesper doesn't allow every single great player in GSL to go to all these foreign tournaments and rack up a lot of prize money as well as playing GSL and Pro League. Maybe there's some issues there. Okay, in terms of the second overall overarching point, like I said, it opens up some of these players going to Western teams, especially these tier 2 and tier 3, and some are even worse than that. Potential hardships it opens them up to. So first and foremost, let's just be absolutely frank here. Here's the first thing that concerned me when I saw some of those names. So when I saw like Fantasy goes to Dead Pixels, and I saw DRG goes to Invasion, and I saw Rain goes to My Insanity, the first thing I thought when I saw those moves was there is zero chance those players are making the same salary they made at their previous team on their new team. Fantasy was on SK Telecom T1, and during Brood War days, the salaries used to be published. He was on like one of those 80 to 100,000 level salaries. And I would assume even in early StarCraft 2, they had him on a similar thing. He was making around 32s of GSL, and sometimes he'd have good games in Pro League. And okay, I'd imagine that at the time, maybe his deal hadn't been totally rejigged, but he must have been on something like 40, 50,000 at least. I'd have to figure. There's no way in hell, I would guess. No, actually, I'd be almost quite certain. I don't think there's any chance he could be making that on someone like Dead Pixels. Now, admittedly, his level isn't very good now, and maybe he can't command market value like that, but what does that say for his career? Like, does he know that if he goes there and he's getting a much, much less, that now if he's gambling on going to foreign tournaments, there's issues there in terms of, like, he's got to do really well to make anything, and he's putting in all the same, maybe the same effort and the same practice time, maybe, to do that, and is that going to happen for him? In terms of a lot of these organizations, I would imagine a lot of these guys have gone down massively in salary. We're talking the amount of money I would imagine they're making in salary is for a Western European person who lives at that standard, or a North American guy. I would imagine they're living now on like a part-time level salary for us in the West in these positions. Yet, obviously they represent these teams, and since we don't know their salary up front, we might imagine they just get a full salary and they're living full-time still. And yet some of them are probably spending full-time hours, but they're making very little money, and now it's all predicated upon they're going to have to go to the tournaments and win the prize money there. So in terms of what they used to before, that's a concern right there. Because that's the thing. If they were going and they were joining Fnatic or SK, the Team Liquid, Evil Geniuses, these big names that we know of in the West, that'd be one thing. Then we could at least imagine some of them are getting big salaries. Team Acer, could imagine that would be the case. But even that's kind of what's worrying. If it is profitable still for big Western teams to get Koreans who are good or were good or have a chance to be, or take a gamble or something, especially when you're talking about like Rain to My Insanity. Rain is still really good and always comes back to being top level elite Korean within a sort of a 5 to 8 month span repeatedly in his career, like 3 or 4 times now. In these particular cases, if it's really not worth the money for them to bid, or they don't have the interest, what does that again say about the health of the Korean scene in StarCraft 2, that these players aren't worth it somehow to put in, and StarCraft 2 as a whole? Because in theory, these teams should be bidding for them and should be able to get them. And the idea that those teams don't, and those teams obviously could offer real salaries, then makes it seem like, well, now that all that's left is these sort of third-tier organizations who just offer a bit, or maybe they just bid amongst each other, or maybe they try to offset, like, well, we can't give you that much salary, but we can send you to X events. And so this is a concern in itself, why it's only these small orgs who are going for this anymore. Okay, so these players are going to go and attend foreign tournaments. Well, even then, how often? Are they attending all the foreign tournaments? It doesn't really seem like it in a lot of these cases. Some of these names, some of them have gone to 1 or 2 events. Some of them really, some might get to go to ones where, some of them we don't know. Are these the ones where you get flown there? It's actually questionable even to what they're getting on that side. It's not like they're just going, well, you get to go to, listen, not as much salary, you get to go to every event though. Like, I'm not really sure too many of these really do. Also, any of them who ever move to the West, it's one thing if you just stay in Korea and you play that team and they'll just fly you to the odd event. There's less abuse you're open to then. And also you get to live in Korea still. But if any of them that are moving to the West to live in team houses, now I'm really worried, because they're going to have a lot of cultural issues, lifestyle issues potentially. Because a lot of these guys, you have to realize, like they live this they're used to a very regimented system. It's the equivalent of like being in sort of a boarding school there. Some of them have left home when they were 14 or 15 years old. Some of them have started out as practice partners, then they've got to move into the house and be on the B team, then they've worked their way up to the A team, then they've played in tournaments, and their whole life has been based around someone telling them when to sleep, when to eat, what to do, how to practice, who they're going to practice against next. Okay, overseeing how they practice and telling them, like, these are the things I want you to work on right now, you're going to do this, and then this is the role you're going to play within our team. All of that is essentially taken away, completely torn down. Then they go to these teams, and some of them, yeah, you get some money, and maybe they have a couple of Western players you could practice with. Maybe now your practice in general isn't as good. Now you have to just find anonymous practice on Korean ladder, which admittedly is a lot easier in StarCraft 2 than it was in Brood War, that sort of scenario, so it's not as big a deal, but a lot of your support structure, in terms of both your game and as a person, is now gone. You don't have all these people taking care of all these aspects of your life that you are entirely ill-equipped to do. I've known a lot of Korean pro gamers, and they were just used to people picking them up and telling them what to do and doing all this. And so as a result, sometimes they'd have sort of a manager or a Western figure who'd initially know that he needed to do some of that. And I'd see the Korean player almost like naively looking at that guy like, oh, he's going to take care of everything for me. Like, he'll do everything. I just leave it all in his hands. And it'd be like, I'm not even sure he actually knows, mate, what you had back home. Like, he's not going to fill that hole entirely. He's going to do some things for you, but he's not necessarily going to be that all-encompassing, like, father, patriarchal figure in terms of you and your team, you know. And so that's also a cultural aspect of Korean culture. Aside from the fact that I've noticed Koreans in general, because a lot of them don't learn really good English and they're worried about speaking English with people, thinking they're going to look like a fool if they're not so good, and they don't know the culture so much. Korea is quite an insular culture. And so as a result, I mean, in League of Legends, Loco Doko, the player who's a Korean player who went to the West and lived in the West beforehand, so he knows the Western culture a lot better than some of them do. He even made a joke on Twitter that, like, he has a Korean puppy theory, which is if you get a Korean player, you should get two, so they have another to play with. It sounds like a joke, and it was obviously said off the cuff in kind of a witty manner. But there's a point to it. I think he has a point, actually. If we've seen some of the Korean players who've gone to the West in other games, some of them that were on their own and then put into Western environments and then left to fend for themselves, they didn't do well in terms of, like, mental health, social health, adapting well. They got very homesick. They would just find themselves wishing, like, oh, I've made all mistakes in my career. Then their game goes downhill. It's like they can get into a vicious cycle very easily. So I worry about some of these players and what kind of support structure they've got for themselves. Because crucially, within Korea, aside from the fact you've lived in the team house and all the rest of it, there's also an aspect of Korean culture. It's like, here's the way you have to understand it, based on my limited experience of being to Korea a bunch of times and reading books about their culture and the psychology of Koreans. Yeah, from the West, when you initially look at it, you actually kind of like feel sorry for the Korean kids sometimes, because you see them like it's very regimented in terms of anyone who's older than you, especially anyone who's like even slightly older or he's above you in a company or whatever. It's quite strict how like you have to behave in a very respectful way to that person, and really it's like there's not a lot of equality there, and so as a result it can seem very harsh from the outside. Like, you'll think to yourself like, wow, you have to like be extra respectful. This guy's just 1 or 2 years older than you, and you have to kind of like, he can boss you around to a degree and he can tell you to do this and the other, and like you can't really like. It's quite a culture shock if you come from the West. But the upside of that is that since you have to do all this stuff like that, it's not just only like respect going up, etc. There's an aspect to which there's then a responsibility from those guys who are older to everyone below them, where they then have to sort of take care of them, because since they're sort of in an older brother role, well, now they have to take care of their younger brother, and they have to be the ones who are in charge, and the responsibility sometimes falls on them if things get fucked up and things go wrong, and they have to know how to help their guys out who are below them, etc. And so some of these Korean players will seem like a dream to a Western manager, because they're just like looking up eagerly, like open wide eyes, like, oh, what do I do now? And then, yeah, oh, is that what I'm doing? Okay, yeah, well, I agree to that, and yeah, you tell me what to do. But then they're expecting to get back what they would have gotten within the Korean culture just by default, because they don't necessarily know that the West isn't like this, and so they're not going to get that back, and that's where there can be problems. And crucially, that's also where, unfortunately, someone can kind of step in, and there's a degree to which, I mean, there's no other way to say it, but they can get taken advantage of. They can be abused within the paradigm of expecting that sort of a relationship to exist, and of this guy to take care of you, and you just do whatever he says, and that's going to be the right approach. And even that's respectful of what you're supposed to do in society. Whereas in the West, especially in esports, we know how many scammers of managers and how many assholes and people who promise stuff and they don't deliver, and they tell you one thing, and then like they tell you they'll give you this, and then they give you slightly less, and they say, oh, well, that's the way it was always going to be, and oh, and it'll be coming next month. You know, all these problems. As a result, in the West, we're trained, or at least the message within our culture is like, be skeptical of these people, And watch out if you're going to get burned if it's not the most respectable person. If it's a tier 2 or tier 3, be more wary. And listen, maybe vet the deal and don't just believe that this will happen. These guys aren't prepared for this sort of thing. So yeah, they can get abused in terms of business. Like, for example, they might not have any negotiation skills. They've never done business deals, so they get completely screwed thinking that they're going to get this much salary and then they get nothing. One of the big problems I've noticed is that a lot of those Korean players, because when I was working with Dasa and when I was involved in the StarCraft 2 scene and going to events, etc., a lot of them had someone would ask me the craziest questions. Like you'd have I won't say who, but you'd have like players who maybe in foreign tournaments might be able to get like the odd semi-final. They might get a semi-final every now and then, and in GSL maybe they make round of 16 every 3 tournaments, and they'd be saying to me like essentially asking me like, if they moved to the West, could they get $5,000 a month salary? And I was like, no. There's maybe like 5 people in the entire Western world could make that sort of salary. You're not one of them. And if it was going to be a Korean, there's about 20 to 30 people who are ahead of you, mate, who are bigger names or would do better in the tournaments. So they had really out of whack ideas about how good the West was going to be in this sense. So I could totally see some of them going out and thinking that I'll join a foreign team like this, only to then find that, like, first of all, they're so above expectation that when they go to talk to these teams, then they find out that, oh, no one's even within that realm. And then they're left just struggling to, I've got to get something, I've got to get some set. And so now they're maybe going the other way. Now maybe they think that they have to take almost very little amount and there's not much available. It's actually very hard to do negotiations in StarCraft 2, even for a Westerner. So I don't know what these Koreans are doing, especially if they're having to do it all through translation and English, if they're not so great and they don't know much about Western culture. Then add in terms of poor career decisions, they can be abused. They might get a team where it's an okay amount and they have an okay setup, but then maybe their manager doesn't send them to the right tournaments, or maybe he mismanages them in terms of how they deal with their practice environment or the flights and all the rest of it. So then their tournament results are worse and they're fucking up their career in that respect. And then also they're not used to thinking for themselves in terms of like having to think of like, on which team would I join next? That's not, you think of the team you're on now and you try your best and you play and you hope that it all works well and that the manager does all you want. Well, that's not a way the Western person thinks. So they might get themselves in a situation where their career is completely fucked as a result of bad situations with these teams and managers. This is one of the areas where, another example of when I worried about this, I actually made a point about this once in a Reddit post when it was announced that Lenok was joining Yo Flash Wolves, which is a team from Taiwan. And I don't know anything about Yo Flash Wolves. I've never looked into the Taiwanese scene. I'm not particularly interested in that part of StarCraft 2. And yeah, it's never going to be something that I'm involved with. So I made a point, as a general point, that I always get concerned when I hear about Koreans potentially moving to these Western teams because of the things I know, like this, like unrealistic expectations, and they might be getting less salary, and it might be the end of their careers essentially, and they might have even worse structure around them, so their results might go down. I made the point that I'm worried about this, and when it opens up for abuse, and people actually just jumped all over me and sort of suggested that I was saying Yo Flash Wolves is shit and they have no money and they're going to con everyone and they rip off and Lenok's going to get abused. Like, that's not what I was suggesting at all. And Lenok in his position in his career then, I can understand why no huge team was going to take a gamble on him. But even so, it's worrying because you think of that name, you think it should be on a top Korean team. It should at least some Western top level team like a Fnatic top team should take a flyer on him, you know. And so the fact that it wasn't kind of hinted at this. So in terms of the aspect of people overlooking probably some of these issues and thinking that's going to be a good thing even, the reason why I think this happens is, aside from the fact that they think it's cool to like, oh, I know that now, like I know Root, oh, it's cool, they're getting a Hydra like an MSL winner. I know that part seems cool, but again, when you put it in the context here, in Hydra's case, not so much, but in terms of the ones like Rain to Mind Sanity, that is a bit worrying because the main reason these people often give, and in Rain's case, his actually might be legit. It really was presented in the news as though he chose not to re-sign with SK Telecom, and because he wanted to attend foreign tournaments. Okay, let's believe that premise for now, because with some of them, I think they just say that as the press release. I'm not sure it is true. I think sometimes they were told they were going to have to retire. It was a way to be like amicable when they were leading, or they know their results aren't going to be so good in Korea, so they think, well, I'll just go to as many foreign tournaments as I can. Okay, but what's worrying about that is when a lot of these Korean players do want to go to foreign tournaments, it's partly like I was saying there. They think they can get insane salaries from Western teams. They can't. They think that by going to these foreign tournaments, especially the ones who've played a lot of Korean tournaments only, they think to themselves like, oh, it's going to be easy compared to Korean tournaments. It is in a way, it's easier, but it's also a different type of learning curve. Like actually, it's more pressure over a couple of days basically there. So you see some even really good players who actually haven't had the super sick results in the West, even as well as they did in Korea. So even that's not a given. So if they give up a lot of their salary and think that they're going to make it all back from the tournaments, not necessarily actually. I mean, you should really have a track record before you do something like that. And as well as unrealistic expectations for money and how many teams are going to be interested in them. Another area that unfortunately, and fans have played a big role in this, which is really unrealistic, is that a lot of these players. Let me explain to you what the experience of a player might be from a Kesper team or a Korean team and going to the West. Let's say all they've done is go to, for the purpose of this explanation, let's imagine they've only gone to a DreamHack Winter. So DreamHack Winter, what happens is you fly into Gothenburg, and then a guy picks you up there, a DreamHack guy. He drives you in a van for 3 hours to Jönköping, because it isn't near Gothenburg. He drives you for 3 hours. You go to the hotel, then you go to the DreamHack event, and the DreamHack event is the biggest LAN in the world. Remember, there's like 10,000 people there or whatever. So there'll be all these people, and then when you play on the stage, there's like hundreds of people in the crowd, and everyone's cheering, and people have signs with your name on it, like, yeah, go Player X, like, I love you, you're the best. And then you meet fans, and they're like, oh, can I have an autograph? Oh, I'm your biggest fan, man, even if they're exaggerating. But okay, let's say some of them are, yeah, I'm a huge fan of yours, I love you, man. And so as a result, you do all that, you win the money, and then you know that it's being streamed around the world and all that. Then you go back to Gothenburg, and then you go back on your plane, you go back to Korea, and you think that's the West. You don't realize that's a very, like, there's only sort of like, let's say like 5 to 8 tournaments of that scale in the West during a year. And it's only for that weekend that everyone really cares about StarCraft, and the West really cares about that. And it's only really a certain very niche audience online who's watching it and does know about you. And in terms of people who think you're a god and think you're amazing, yeah, some of them do now. Maybe they're more casual. They watch the scene now and they know a bit about you. It's not the same as having like super hardcore fan base. And so unfortunately, I get the sense that some of them get a really unrealistic expectation of how big StarCraft 2 is in the West, and how big esports is in the West, and how big they are in the West. And so some of them maybe naively think, because of some IEMs they went to, or DreamHacks they went to, like, oh, I'm going to be like a star over there, or my career is going to get better when I go over there. Whereas actually, as we've seen a lot of these scenarios here, either people have to accept that their careers are getting worse, or they're going to be worse anyway. There's almost no cases here I've given of these people here where they're going to go to the West and their careers are going up from here. They've been at the best place before, where they had a super sick Kesper salary, they were making a lot of money and making all these GSL finishes, or they at least were making a lot of money and they had like an established name and respect, etc. Their careers aren't going up, so I really worry for them in that sense. And from knowing some of these players myself, like seeing the difficulties they can get into. And so obviously as well, their careers can be done at this point if it goes wrong. So it's not the same as a Western player who was on this downward spiral. You could think of some names. I'm sure you could insert some now where they had to go from Team A to Team B, and then you know that the salary's gone down a bit, and they're not going to get as many placings at tournaments. Because they have the Western mindset and they know how big esports is in the West, they're going to start to make plans at least. Like, you know what, maybe they deferred a year of university and they go, you know what, maybe I should look into that. Like, if my results bottom out this year, I'll pick up that course again, I'll go do that. Or, you know what, my dad's got a job for me in this business, or hey, maybe I can start doing this career path I'd planned to do before StarCraft 2. They can start transitioning out, and they have obvious paths for them. Some of these guys I'm talking about, who their whole success formula in life has just been like, be as good as I can at the game, practice as hard as I can at the game, do whatever my manager and boss tells me, and things will work out. Like, I'll get results in the game, that'll transfer to success, and then I'll have a good placing within my team, and that's how I make money, and that's how I advance my career, and that's all I have to do. And you know what, a lot of them haven't even thought beyond their career. Like, even a great player like a Flash type guy, some of them don't even really know what they're going to do when StarCraft ends, and how to transition into real life. So some of these guys who are in a lesser position or aren't even at that scale are going to be in real trouble. And unfortunately, when they're in this position now, when they're making less money and they're going to just a few events, and there's a big pressure to do really well at those events, and it's going to be hard to negotiate and get better career positions out of this, some of them are going to unfortunately put those hours in and still think that the way out is to just go hard at the game still and go everything at it and give up everything like they used to, like being like a monk for StarCraft 2, and that's going to get me out and I'm going to get back to where I was. And so it's a bit of a wish fulfillment type scenario, and so it's kind of a worrying situation. So this isn't a video where I've got some solutions for anyone, or I've got like a way that it should be done differently, but I hope that it's like food for thought in terms of Westerns when they think of these players going to these teams, because yeah, it's not a good situation. Like when is Dead Pixels going to be one of the best Western teams in all of Europe and at an elite level of your esports organization? It seems unlikely. So a player who plays for them, odds are he isn't going to be either, and he hasn't got that many places to go from there. And you wonder about where the StarCraft team's scene is heading if some of these players are around these places. Even though, listen, within their own rights, I'm sure those teams are doing their best now. And it's good that there are teams, at least, that can give someone a place like that. But it's a worrying kind of sign for where StarCraft 2 is as a game globally and in terms of the Korean scene, I think.